Greetings from Hamburg, everyone. Welcome to tonight's panel, which is one of the initiatives organized by ISPI in collaboration with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the framework of Rome-Med Dialogue, which will be the next round of meetings are going to take place between 1st and 3rd of December. For almost 2 decades, Iran's nuclear program has been a source of global controversy. This issue has affected Iran's relations with the global power, with the regional players, Iran's neighbors, and had left the country indeed with a long list of socioeconomic challenges. A deal that was concluded in the hope of ending some of these issues collapsed with the unilateral withdrawal of the U.S. administration back in 2018. After the last presidential election, a new effort was initiated to revive the diplomatic effort to end these long-standing diplomatic challenges. Tonight at this panel, we will be unpacking some of the aspects of these negotiations and hopefully trying to shed some light on the potential consequences of a deal should one be reached. We have a very distinguished panel with us tonight, whom I'm going to briefly introduce. And the structure of this panel is going to be in the format of a round of questions. So we will have 3 rounds of questions. In each round, 1 question to each panelist, and at the end of the discussion, we're going to hopefully keep some time for the questions from the audience, which you're most welcome to post them in the Q&A box of your applications, Zoom applications. So I will start with introducing Dr. Barbara Slavin. Barbara doesn't really need introduction, so she is a very well-known figure in the field of Iranian studies, and she is the head of Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Barbara. Our second panelist is going to be Mr. Esfandiar Batmaglic. Yar is a visiting fellow at the Middle East North Africa program at the European Council for Foreign Relations, and he's founder and CEO of Bourse and Bazaar Foundations. And last but not least, Dr. Abdurrasood Ifsalar, who is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute and a visiting professor at University Cattolica in Milan. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you here tonight with us. Thank you for dedicating the time to discuss this timely issue. So without me talking much, because this is an opportunity to get your insight on this topic, I'm going to start asking the questions. And I will start with Barbara, not only just because ladies first, but also because it's going to, Barbara's insight is going to give a very suitable angle to start the discussion. Barbara, during the last Doha Forum, which happened to take place only a couple of weeks ago, the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Mr. Borrell, said that Iran and the world powers are very close to reviving a deal which probably will be quite similar to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or as we all call it, the JCPOA. On the same occasion, the U.S. Special Envoy of Iran, Robert Malley, said that he was not confident that a renewed nuclear deal was in the horizon. So what's the latest of the play on this deal and this very long and slow process? You're based in the U.S. Capitol. Can you give us the U.S. perspective? What are the main challenges as far as the U.S. is concerned?
Well, first of all, let me thank ISPI and you, Sarah, for being part of this. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with also such distinguished speakers and old friends. It's been a year since these negotiations started up in Vienna, and I know everyone is very impatient about the slow progress. Obviously, there was a major obstacle, which was the Iranian presidential elections last June. A new negotiating team was named, and there was a long hiatus in the talks. Nevertheless, I think we are extremely close to a deal. The Europeans have played a very important role as go-betweens between the United States and Iran. Iran refuses to sit in the same room with the American negotiators, which has made this process even more cumbersome. Their argument being that the U.S. quit the deal and so is no longer entitled to sit in the same room with Iran. However, a document has been reached, a 20-page document, which lays out all the steps that are required in terms of Iran rolling back its nuclear program and a schedule for easing sanctions. The remaining problem seems to be over something which is frankly more symbolic than substantive, and that is the fact that the State Department in 2019, as part of the Trump maximum pressure policy, designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, as it's called here in Washington. And Iran is demanding that this designation be removed. Frankly, the IRGC would remain sanctioned under numerous other authorities. There would be no American or Western business dealings with any entity that is connected to the IRGC, but this seems to be a symbolically important matter in terms also of domestic politics, frankly, on both sides. So there have been messages that have been exchanged, ways to resolve this. Enrique Mora, who is the sort of day-to-day coordinator of the talks for the European Union, has gone to Tehran, has come to Washington, and there were meetings just today in Vienna of various negotiators, again, talking about how to bring this to a close. We also had a break. Iran had its New Year, which kind of slowed things down for a couple of weeks. So I remain optimistic that this will be resolved one way or another within the next few weeks. I think to hold the whole process hostage to this issue is not worth it. It's not worth it for Iran. It's not worth it for the other parties to the deal. So I think that's where I would say things stand at present.
Thank you very much. Overall, before I move to the next question, I just want to have a brief follow-on. Overall, do you expect this deal to be relatively, apart from, for example, a symbolic gesture, as you mentioned, the IRGC delisting, is it going to be fairly similar to what we had in 2015, or are there any fundamental differences between the two deals?
No, not at all. This is a revival of a deal that was reached in 2015 and also and got through Congress, may I point out, at that time. And I'm even more optimistic that there would be less congressional opposition this time. Under the way this is structured, this is an executive agreement. The sanctions are relieved by executive order by the president, and the fact that the Biden administration is behind this is really the most important thing.
Thank you very much. It was a great starting point to start with expectations of in Washington, expectations in Tehran, the fundamental differences between the two deals and how close we are. So now I would like to move to Esfandiar and sort of try to dig in a little bit deeper on that specific question of delisting of IRGC, if I may. The removal of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or as we call it, the IRGC, from the State Department's FTO list seems to be, as Barbara correctly mentioned, the last unresolved demand for signing a deal after all these months of negotiation. Recent reports said that apparently this issue is also linked with the killing of Al-Quds Force, late General Qasem Soleimani. So understandably, the delisting of IRGC has some galvanized opposition in Washington, amongst Iran's regional adversaries or some of the regional powers, Iran's neighbors. Why has Iran demanded this at this stage, considering that this issue can indeed jeopardize the entire process? And if eventually this was to be granted by the US, what would be the domestic and regional consequences of the listing of IRGC?
So first off, thank you to ISPI for having me. I think, Sarah, the answer to this question actually stems from the last question you asked, which is whether or not the deal that is being negotiated now by the Raisi administration will be substantively different from the deal that we had in 2015. And as Barbara said, there will not be any substantive differences. And this is exactly why it is politically challenging for the Raisi government to have gone through this process of negotiation with the United States and with the other parties that remain in the JCPOA. Generally speaking, I think the challenge has been that the constituency around the political constituency around the Raisi administration is very different from that was around the Rouhani administration that delivered the deal in 2015. However, the national security elites that gave the mandate to the Rouhani administration to negotiate the deal in 2015 and to conclude it then are, broadly speaking, the same cast of characters now. And the strategic logic for why Iran would want to get this deal fully restored with the US as a member again, with sanctions, secondary sanctions lifted, remains as strong as it was then. I think it is so strong now. So you have this mismatch. You have a strong logic for the deal, and you have a new political constituency that has been skeptical of the deal historically because it has been a useful way to undermine their political rivals in Iran, namely the Rouhani government. And I think has some skepticism that also stems from generally a different worldview and a different, a sense that maybe connecting Iran's national security interests with mutual interests with Europe and the US might be a strategic mistake. And so for the negotiators of the Raisi administration, this is a very difficult tightrope to walk. And essentially what they have to do is make the same deal feel like a different deal. And they've done that in a couple ways. First, they've refused to engage in direct talks with the US, absent some sort of gesture unilaterally from the US that would furnish grounds for those talks. They have taken a slow approach to the talks since the change in government. So although we had, I believe, 6 rounds of negotiations that had made excellent progress, the administration took time in Iran to pause, reassess, have its own consultations with its new political constituency to rebuild that consensus to continue. And now we're at the stage where the negotiators have arrived at the same deal, and we're talking about how you package it, at the very end when we're on the cusp of hopefully of an announcement. And I think this is where it becomes critically important for even symbolic things like the removal of the IRGC from the FTO list to be granted by the US as something that the Raisi administration can portray as a significant concession, even if both they and the Americans know that it's not. So a lot of this, as Barbara said, is about political symbolism, to the same extent in Tehran as it is in Washington. But I think this explains why it's become a stumbling block late in the game.
Thank you very much. I also would like to have a quick follow-on on this with you, if I may. IRGC has been presented domestically as the protector of the national security of Iran. If you talk to any analyst these days who is based in Tehran, this is the starting point of the conversation they're going to have with you, that this is our red line, this organization protects our national security, and we are indeed insisting on delisting it. And some may even go further than that and argue that IRGC is a very popular organization, but at the same time, IRGC is a very organization who shot down a passenger jet, killed 176 innocent, mostly Iranian citizens, to turn around later and just say that, well, if we didn't kill them ourselves, then the US fighter jets would have killed more of them. So there is this, very sensitive situation about the IRGC domestically. So do you think that a potential delisting of IRGC is going to empower IRGC domestically, give them a carte blanche to get more involved in domestic issues, economic, regional, politics, and so on? Or it's going to be business as usual and they're not really bothered with this change of strategy in DC?
So I think there are two things that we need to consider here. First, whether or not the US designates the IRGC using certain legal instruments has really no bearing on the perception of the Iranian public with regards to the IRGC as an institution that they deal with every day. And so I see no link between the decision whether or not to delist and a change in public perception. There will continue to be strains between the IRGC and the Iranian public that need to be addressed in a domestic context. But from an operational standpoint, at the same time, the behaviors we might be concerned about that the IRGC is engaged in either within Iran or within the region, these are not behaviors that the listing has a meaningful impact on for two reasons. First is that even if we were to believe that listings like this have an impact on the operational capabilities of a body like the IRGC, there will remain a significant set of other sanctions, including a second designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization that will remain in place and which Iran has not sought the lifting of. But even if we feel that those listings are not important, from the standpoint of whether or not this will embolden the IRGC, I would point here to comments made by General McKenzie, who's, I believe, the outgoing commander of CENTCOM, who said in a recent press availability that this will have no bearing on how the US armed forces in that theater deal with the IRGC as a potential threat. And so, ultimately, we're talking about three letters, FTO, and they don't have a meaningful impact on where we go here. All they matter for is the political expediency of this deal, and the hope is that it's neither too costly for Biden to deliver this concession, nor too sort of costly for Iran to limit their request to this single small concession.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Of course, please go ahead. Yes.
Two-finger there. I think that we have to also recognize, and I just wrote a piece about this for the Atlantic Council, that the IRGC became more aggressive toward the United States in particular, and the Emiratis and the Saudis after the designation. So there is always the possibility that that with the JCPOA restored and other developments that I know we'll talk about in the region, that there will be fewer problems with them, certainly regionally, and this terrorism designation will seem really not relevant. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much. Well, one might also have a counter argument on that and say that if they did all of those aggressive behaviors in the region towards the U.S. interests and U.S. allies in the region, and then they got delisted as a result, so it shows that they can win lots of brownie points by misbehaving. So they might even become more emboldened. But that's a topic of a completely new panel. Hopefully, I will propose that to Rumit to organize one on that. Abdurrasul, thank you for patiently waiting for your question. So I'm going to now move on, and that's sort of the conversation on the IRGC and the strategies, regional role, and so on, links us smoothly to the question that I would like to raise to you, and that is specifically focusing on the regional aspect of Iran's relations with the region in the context and how it's going to be affected by the deal. The Gulf states and Israel fears have restored that a restored nuclear deal will empower Iran, as I mentioned earlier, or perhaps the IRGC being the symbol of Iranian face across the region and Iran's activities across the region. At a time when the US is perceived to gradually disengaging from the region, it might be misperception, but we hear this argument very often by analysts, by policymakers across the region. Having said that, the U.S. State Department tries to calm the nerves down across the region, give reassurances to old allies and strategic allies in the region that this deal is not going to have any sort of particular impact on the U.S. relations with the region. But also the tension between Iran and some of the regional players have increased. There are this openly talking about military and cyber attacks, drone attacks, attacks between Iran and Israel. The Houthis last month attacked Jeddah, which was sort of, some of these attacks are perceived as having been conducted by direct military assistance from Tehran. So what should Iran's neighbors, after, make a long story short, expect for the future of the region's security post-deal? Would a new agreement help stabilize the region, or make the tension even more visible amongst the regional allies, amongst the regional adversaries?
Thank you so much, Sarah. Let me also first thank ISPI for having this very great panel, timely indeed. Let me put your question, reframe this to another point of view, that what if we don't have the deal? I mean, what would be the security dynamic in the region if we don't have the deal? The fact is that, a scenario with continuation of U.S., let's say, sanctions or stronger sanctions under Biden, Plan B will lead up to Iran's, as we know from 2019 and 2020's Iranian decision model, will scale up Iran's nuclear activities. And we will have a new round of nuclear brinkmanship by the Iranians. Well, this has been proved by the incidents that we had in the last couple of years. And the logic behind that is, as also Barbara was mentioned correctly, Iran is a kind of actor that adjusts its behavior with the level of threat that it receives. So it will not engage in talks until it creates a kind of, let's say, leverages that things is suitable for countering the pressure that is receiving at the moment. So having this in mind, I think that in a scenario that when we don't have the deal, those countries, basically what you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, will be on the front line of any clash between Iran and US, and that's exactly explained why these countries, came in 2021 in a parallel line while the JCPOA faith was still not clear, to make a talk with Iran. I mean, that was a sort of insurance policy. So. To make it short, the first, we need to remember this very carefully, that the first function of the JCPOA is a kind of a crisis prevention role that it has. So it prevents an emerging nuclear crisis for the next decade at least. But the bigger question is, so if this calm after, we resolve the issue of nuclear can lead to some sort of a bigger arrangement, well, I think we need to go back to history. I mean, we have a lot of non-proliferation or arms control discussions and talks in the Cold War period between the US and USSR that none of them were able to, by one deal, to transform the bigger geopolitical realities of their time. So there were smaller steps into a bigger, let's say, process that led to a kind of a new structure of regional security. So the idea, that we could have a kind of a deal that responds to all possible disagreements between Iran and its regional neighbors and change completely the dynamics of the bigger geopolitical realities in the region. It's a kind of, I think, not based neither on the let's say, history of non-proliferation treaties and not also the history of what we have seen between US and Iran and Saudi Arabia and the rest of the regional powers. So my last point, but again, in this line is the fact that, what is these bigger geopolitical realities that I'm talking? We're witnessing actually a kind of progressing in parallel with the JCPOA these days in Negev, where the kind of, NATO-like security architecture that Israel is pushing toward materialization in the Persian Gulf region, which is, it has a kind of anti-Iranian coalition function. It's a kind of anti-Iranian balancing architecture. And that's basically, it's happening in parallel to JCPOA. If we have JCPOA or if we don't have the JCPOA, I think Tehran will be determined to counter and deter this geopolitical reality. So the argument here is very much based on the fact that how, we can, by through the JCPOA, create a kind of a sphere that we can manage the upcoming nuclear, let's say, crisis. But at the same time, we create a kind of open space of political dialogue in the region that can lead us to a kind of a discussion over bigger issues. Because, so just to sum up my point is that, I see mostly Iran's, missile operation also what we saw in Erbil just recently, the last 3 weeks, that, it was a kind of a messaging to the Persian Gulf states that, going too much toward Israel will have some sort of consequences. So without the JCPOA, the argument, I think, is that we will see more of these lines of attentions to grow and rise in the region.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Was that? No, sorry. I thought Isfandiar said something. No, thank you so much. Yes, you understandably pointed out that the regional issues and the uncertainties and the concerns especially amongst the GCC states with Iran had to be solved on a completely different track. And I think we've seen some successful signs of understanding that at least exist across the region. And the Baghdad talks are good evidence to prove that. But also at the same time, when you talk to the GCC analysts, they often say and complain that Iranians do not, the call that they receive, Iranian officials from the GCC, is not the call that they're expecting. They need a call to receive from somebody else. And that somebody else is the United States, and they are not receiving the call from them, the kind of call that they want to receive. And therefore, this is not going to, as long as those difficulties are not resolved, talking with Iran directly with the between GCC and Iran is not going to result into any fruitful conclusion. So thank you so much. In the interest of time, if I may, Barbara, I'm going to link my two next questions into one. And I know it's a little bit, they're sort of interlinked, obviously, but they're not exactly completely the same questions. So one point I would like you to touch upon is, of course, we cannot talk about any issue within the realm of global affairs these days without talking about Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And of course, Iran being relatively close over the past decade or so with Russia, how do you think this is going to affect future of Iran-Russia relations? Is it going to sour the relation? Is it going to open potentials for Iran becoming a competitor for Russia, especially with the opening up the energy markets and so on and so on, or the other way around? And the second question I would like to ask is that you touched upon the fact that the previous deal was approved by the Congress. You don't expect even as much controversy raised by the Congress this time around. Iran has demanded guarantees from the U.S. What sort of guarantees are they expecting? What sort of guarantees, realistically speaking, U.S. is able to offer Iran, if they were to offer any? Thank you.
Sure. If I may also, just following on the previous discussion of Abdul Rasul, let me say that I think the JCPOA is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for regional de-escalation. So without it, things get worse. With it, you have at least a possibility of broader de-escalation, although obviously not a guarantee. In terms of Iran-Russia, this is fascinating. It's another example, I'm afraid, of the way in which popular opinion and the policies of the government diverge. There is widespread outrage among Iranians at the atrocities committed by the Russians in Ukraine, and even some reporting of it. But the government line is it's the fault of NATO for expanding, and there is a strong security relationship between Iran and Russia. The economic relationship, and Yar can talk to this more, is not very strong. It's only, I think, $4 billion a year in trade, and there is talk of expanding that, but the two economies are really not compatible for trade. I mean, Russia can provide nuclear material and it has some role to play under the JCPOA in terms of taking excess uranium, that sort of thing, reconfiguring some of Iran's installations, but these are not natural economic partners. So this is a political decision, and of course the Raisi people are hardliners. They're more associated with this look east policy, Russia and China. And I think there's a real question about whether Ukraine will affect that. And I think a lot will depend, obviously, on the outcome of the war. If Putin is humiliated, if Russia is perceived as having been defeated by the Ukrainians with the support of the West, this could perhaps cause a little bit of rethinking in Tehran about this relationship. No guarantee here, but certainly it's an uncomfortable relationship increasingly, I think, for many in Iran. In terms of guarantees of the deal, look, the way it works, no, a future president could withdraw again from the agreement, but I think the best insurance against that is to get back into the deal and show that it works in rolling back the Iranian nuclear program. If we get some other benefits in terms of regional stability, that would also be helpful. We've had the Trump experiment and it failed, and that is the best argument, I think, against withdrawing again from the agreement. But the way it's structured, unfortunately, there are no ironclad guarantees. And I think Iran simply has to recognize that and take whatever benefits it can from the next couple of years selling oil at $100 a barrel. That could be getting access to frozen reserves. That could certainly be an important benefit, whatever happens in 2025.
Thank you very much. One quick follow on that. It's a question raised by the audience, and I think it's quite relevant to address it now. Do you see the U.S. Congress opposition between the Republicans and Democrats as an actual obstacle to the renewed deal?
Yeah, no, the way the legislation about this was structured, you need essentially 2/3 of both houses of Congress to oppose the deal. And the Democrats have a majority in both houses, so there is no chance of that. And even in the Senate, where, you might have a couple of Democrats who are lukewarm about the deal, you would need 60 votes against the deal to block it. And that just doesn't exist.
Thank you very much. Esfandiar, I'm going to follow on one of the very important points that Barbara just mentioned with raising a question to you, and that is oil and oil export. Obviously, one major element of maximum pressure campaign by the Trump administration was to bring down Iran's oil exports. Iran has already increased its oil export even before we know what is the exact conclusion of the ongoing negotiations. The CEO of the National Iranian Oil Company, Mr. Mohsen Khojastmer, said a couple of days ago that oil export has increased by 40% and production capacity has reached a pre-sanction level of nearly 4 million barrels per day. So do you think that these claims are signs of proving how successful Iran in sanctions circumvention has been, or if you look at it from the other way, how unsuccessful the U.S. maximum pressure was, or how much of this do you think could be attributed to the war in Ukraine, i.e., the European demand and the global demand for energy has worked in favor of Iran to sort of turning a blind eye on some of the sanctions, and if the deal is concluded in the near term, how much expansion do you see from this level that Iranian officials are claiming to have reached in terms of production capacity and export capacity?
So I will do my best to answer a multifaceted question. So the first thing I would say is that Iran has definitely benefited from the fact that oil prices have been relatively high in recent months. But what is happening right now with the claims that Iran's oil exports have recovered is not a reflection of the crisis in Ukraine. That impact isn't really being felt yet. What we have seen is that there has been a recovery in Iranian oil exports, but those exports are going to only one customer, which is China. And so I wouldn't necessarily frame this as an issue of sanctions evasion. I think there is the possibility that the Biden administration decided to take a kind of non-enforcement stance on some of the secondary sanctions related to the fact that they were trying to enter an agreement that would have seen these exports again permitted under US sanctions regulations. And in order to try and engineer those negotiations, they needed to have China as a cooperative and helpful party in the nuclear talks. And so I think it would have been detrimental to the negotiations had a very harsh stance been taken on the posture of US sanctions, given that basically China is engaged in an activity where, from its standpoint as a party to the JCPOA, those oil purchases are perfectly normal. And in fact, from the standpoint of also European law, there are no sanctions at the moment on Iranian energy. It is the reluctance of companies and banks that is leading to the fact that there are no energy exports to Europe. So the point is that Iran can, we know now, under maximum pressure sanctions that have not been multilateralized, continue to export some energy. But the benefits of that economically are still limited by the fact that the broader picture of Iran's engagement in the global economy is subject to constraints. So, for example, if Iran is only exporting oil to one trade partner, which is China, it means that it continues to run trade deficits with a lot of other trade partners where it really would like to be earning revenue. For example, India, Turkey, and certainly Europe. And so what's at stake in the restoration of the nuclear deal is not only an increase in volumes, which is important, but it's also an increase in the range of countries with which Iran is trading that oil. And that has other economic benefits that are not simply captured in the increase in oil revenue that we would expect as more Iranian crude oil hits global markets. And to put a sort of rough figure on what kind of rebound we might expect, it's difficult to say exactly what the willingness of non-Chinese refiners would be to take Iranian oil. There have been some signals from the South Koreans and the Indians that, you know, they're in advanced conversations where in advance of the lifting of sanctions, they're preparing to take more Iranian oil. I think it's a question mark over how much oil Europe would buy. But broadly speaking, I think we would look to Iran is likely, particularly under the current energy market situation, to return to the levels of exports that we saw in 2016 and beyond. So I think essentially we're looking at a situation where Iran would double its exports from around 1 or 1.2 million barrels per day to around 2 to 2.4 million barrels per day. So it's a significant jump, but of course, what I think is more important is who is Iran selling oil to, not simply how much they're selling.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting point that we raised. Where I sit now in Germany, you know, we import 40% of our energy from Russia. Since the war in Ukraine, the German politicians have been running around the world trying to find replacement for the Russian energy. They went and even negotiated with the Qatari officials in Doha, and they were told that, sorry, well, the ship has sailed. We already have long-term contracts with other buyers, Asian buyers that you mentioned. Do you think this situation is likely to happen to Iranian oil? Have the Chinese had secured sort of long-term contracts to buy crude oil from Iran, or Iran is in a relatively flexible position?
So, you know, I think the thing that would be limiting China's predatory instinct there to really go after cheap Iranian oil and long-term contracts is that China is buying Iranian oil because it is taking a balanced approach to its energy security in the Middle East. It knows that if it only buys oil from one major producer in the Middle East, it will lead to tensions at a regional level that would threaten the reliability of those exports generally, and certainly the price of oil on global markets. So from the Chinese standpoint, they maybe had an opportunity, given Iran's predicament and the discounts that Iran was offering, to actually reduce their purchases of Saudi oil, for example, and at the moment Saudi oil is being traded with a premium, and increase their purchases of Iranian oil instead. They have not taken that approach, I think, very sensibly, because they understood that these two countries are at loggerheads and there's no reason to add additional cause for potential conflict. So we have heard, for example, as the maximum pressure campaign was being imposed, Iranian officials say that if we can't sell our oil, no one's going to be able to sell their oil. And whether or not we think that was a very credible threat, at the end of the day, I think the Chinese realized that there's plenty of oil to go around, plenty of demand in China, and let's just purchase for multiple customers. So I don't think we're in a situation where China has locked in Iranian supply and at the expense of other customers that might want to tap those 1 million barrels per day that might come onto the market.
Thank you very much. Abdurrasul, it's interesting. I had a question on my list of questions, and the exact same question has been raised by one of the audience. So it shows that we are being watched by very, very knowledgeable audience. So the question is that you recently published something on a concept which you call it Persian Gulf Ostpolitik, where the leaders of both sides of the Gulf can rethink their definition of regional security approach, and to overcome some of the differences. And of course, this is something that the former Foreign Minister Zarif has initiated. Hope, right? The Hormuz peace initiative was was proposed by the previous Minister of Foreign Affairs in Tehran. Would you elaborate a little bit? What do you mean by this Ostpolitik? How would it play in the Gulf region?
Actually, by Ostpolitik, I meant, the need to reset approach, as you said correctly, toward regional security. And I think the region can learn from what the lessons of Germany's Willy Brandt's recognition of East Germany, and new political borders of post-war II in 1969. The lesson was simple but quite important, and that was the fact that the status quo should be recognized, and geopolitical realities that are there, and you need to change the approach from abandoning leverage-taking policies, and at least give a period of diplomacy, give a period of calm to diplomacy to work. But basically to change this and to go toward this such a Ostpolitics, we need to work on the leaders' interpretation of competitors' action. Their competitors' action. Let me give you some example. We were talking about JCPOA today a lot, but the JCPOA, by the way it is seen by Saudi Arabia and UAE, if this view is defined as a way that U.S. is giving Iran a new license for expansion in the region, and also perceive it as a kind of a leverage that is being granted to Tehran, then we're in trouble because Saudis are going to balance this type of win that they presume that Iranians have given. So they're going to either raise the pressure on Iran or try to prevent Iran to receive the gains that it wanted to receive from the deal. So the similar, not constructive approach can be adopted by the Iranians. And for example, if Tehran start to see the deal as a kind of a moment of a victory in the region and as an opportunity, we know that US now is in trouble with Russia, so is busy with Russia. So many already started to say in Tehran that that's an opportunity. So, using this opportunity to more expansionist, more supporting more, let's say, non-state actors in different countries in the region, then again, we're in the problem. So what is the point? The point is that because we have not basically worked on the way that the politicians need to see the JCPOA. What I have talked about the Ostpolitik was exactly leaving behind this way of looking at the regional security environment after the deal. So the Saudi Emiratis also could see the fact that, the deal protects them from a nuclear Iran, which is, I think an armed nuclear Iran is very much more dangerous than non-one, because, then Iranians will not talk with the Arab neighbors and will use it, they will have a kind of extended nuclear deterrence. They will use it to protect whatever non-alliance systems they have. So the deal is exactly what gives this winning card to Saudis and UAEs, to not having a kind of Iran which can extend its nuclear deterrent to the whole region. Also, I think for Iranians, if you just look to apart from the economic benefits that we mostly talk about, but if you look at the political agenda of President Raisi, important part of it is about bringing back normal relations with the Arab neighbors of Iran, and also the legacy of Supreme Leader Khamenei is here at the stake. I don't think that he wants to leave Iran in a moment that it's in a complete break with its neighbors in the region. So changing this way that we look at it, I think part of the solution. So actually a kind of unwritten commitment to hold new leverage takings by all actors probably can bring up a kind of a positive political climate to address other issues. But back to my, the points that I wanted to mention is the fact that, here to create this dynamic, we need the play of external actors. Here, the EU is a quite an important player, because the EU's stake in the Persian Gulf, I think, is going to rise. The priority of Persian Gulf, particularly after the Ukrainian crisis, as you said, because of the energy issue, is rising. So I'm hopeful that EU will come to the conclusion that it needs to deliver more, let's say, diplomatic tools and diplomatic resources to create this, to push the regional actors to accept this type of, a kind of a moment of call to receive. But on the ground, unfortunately, I think that's not where we are going. I see the rhetoric on both sides, both from Saudis and both from Iranians, in a dimension that basically they're seeing it as a kind of a zero-sum approach. There's a win by the JCPOA for Iran and a defeat for Saudi Arabia, and then a kind of a cycle of, unfortunately, kind of a cycle of creating new balances. So I should say that I'm cautiously optimistic about the positive effect of the JCPOA in post-security environment of the Persian Gulf, but as an idea, Ostpolitik talks about this reset of approach that we can take to the regional security. Thank
you very much. Yes or no question. Do you think EU will be given more ground to get more involved in playing a diplomatic sort of deal maker, mediator role in the region after JCPOA?
I think yes, there is this growing understanding in Brussels, and I hope in the next communication that will come out from the Brussels, we will hear a kind of a new approach toward the Persian Gulf, which is important to be balanced in the sense that between the Arab side of the Gulf and the Iranian side, because again, if EU shifts, that's that balancing, delicate balancing between the two actors. I think it's the core.
Thank you very much. Yes, you rightly mentioned, and Iranian think tanks and organizations since the late 1990s have written on this, the need for a regional security structure, a security structure which doesn't rely on external factors. And that's a fairly valid argument, but at the same time, if you talk to the GCC policymakers and analysts these days, they don't only raise concern about Iran's nuclear program. There is the cyber capacity, there is the drones attacks, there is the missile capacity. So there is multifaceted issues that cannot be addressed through JCPOA, and that requires a new approach to address all of these challenges. So we're quickly running out of time, and I keep getting questions from the audience. I want to combine two of the questions and open the floor to Esfandiar and Barbara to both of you pick and choose whichever aspect of this question you feel comfortable with. The question those questions are related to the fact that the previous deal did not give the sanction lift to Iran that Iran expected. There was, despite the fact that nominally on paper the sanctions were lifted, US dollar transactions were still blocked. They were still kept at the mercy of the US president to give them 90 days waivers if they felt generous enough. So, despite the fact that sanctions were lifted, a lot of European businesses stayed away from doing business with Iran because they simply didn't want to jeopardize their positions in the international level. So what sort of guarantees do you think there is that this time around it's not going to be the same as it was last time? How much guarantees the European businesses would be given, how much flexibility the European and other global businesses will be given to, especially banks and financial institutions?
I think that's one for Yar. Let him start anyway.
That's very kind, Barbara. So I think here we need to differentiate between two kinds of economic activity. There's trade and there's investment. And when we talk about the failures of sanctions relief, the two are often conflated. What we know is that a lot of European companies struggle to proceed with planned investments in the Iranian market because they lack the ability to get financing, because banks were not willing to finance projects on Iran to sort of make those commitments to a market that had just been sanctioned. And those problems are going to persist with the new sanctions relief. They are probably a little bit worse because the political vulnerability of the nuclear deal has been demonstrated. And generally, we're in a moment where banks are de-risking, not only because of Iran, but also because of the Russia crisis. And so we'll probably see some limitations there. But as I've written for ECFR a couple months ago, we can look at a different outlook for trade, and arguably Iran's economy has never been a major recipient of foreign investment. And so the fact that Iran's economy can develop pretty high rates of growth, 5, 6, 7% per year, is not something that has really been dependent on investment. It's depended on significant revenues from oil exports, but also the fact that you have a large domestic economy and a diversified economy where you have a manufacturing base that can deliver growth without actually the need for foreign investment. And here is where trade becomes really important, because we can expect a rebound in trade related to the fact that financial and logistical limitations are going to be reduced, and related to the fact that the general economic uplift in Iran will see demand among Iranian manufacturers recover for the importation of machinery and parts, broadly speaking technology, that can help boost output in Iran and also raise the quality of production. And I think for the Iranians, that is a sufficient goal here, because what we're talking about is the opportunity cost of not taking this chance to get sanctions relief, even if it's only going to be for the next 3 years, to give breathing room for households and firms and allow the economy to grow at a faster pace than it currently is. Right now, Iran's economy will be growing at maybe 1-2% without the benefits of sanctions relief. With sanctions relief, that growth will rise considerably. And I think the final point I would make is that the availability of goods from the international market and the reduction of the barriers that bring those goods into Iran at higher prices, because we're talking about transaction costs, will also help the Iranian government address inflation. And that is one thing that the Rouhani administration was able to do, even though the sanctions relief was disappointing in the period from basically 2014 to 2018, is that inflation was able to be brought down from above 30% to below 10%. And if the Raisi administration can do the same, which I think is a reasonable expectation, that's a really consequential, beneficial impact for ordinary people in Iran. And I think that even on its own is reason enough to do this deal from a purely political standpoint.
Thank you. No, you're completely right in the sense that Iran should be naturally keen on getting this deal. But the question was not about Iran. The question was about are there going to be tangible, real sanction lifts that helps all of those good things that you mentioned and listed to be achieved for the Iranian economy? Because as one of the questions here mentioned, that said, what are the guarantees that Iran will be granted on verifiability, and are we aware of any guarantees to be granted to European banks allowing compliance with the U.S. Secondary sanctions? And absence of these guarantees in the absence of these guarantees, we will face the same situation as we did in 2016, where banks were unable, even though Iranian businesses they needed, trade was, kept at mercy of these banks clearing transactions for Iran, but nobody was willing to do that. So is it going to be different this time around?
I'll respond very briefly. I think the short answer is yes, we will see a rebound in trade. And the way to think about it is that there are companies, both European and non-European, currently engaged in trade with Iran, both in the humanitarian sector and non-sanctioned goods, or with counterparts who are not sanctioned. And it's not a negligible amount of trade. Iran is an enormous economy, and its resilience is largely a function of the fact that trade has continued even in this very adverse environment. So the first thing we should look at is, are the companies that are currently exporting to Iran or buying from Iran, are they going to be in a position to grow their trade? And so we're not talking necessarily about new entrants, new decisions to engage the market. It's are the current players going to be able to do more?
Okay. So there are some grounds already open, some channels already open, and we expect expansion of that. Thank you very much. Barbara, next question is to you, if I may. It's from the audience again. The U.S. recently imposed new sanctions on a number of entities allegedly involved in Iran's ballistic missile programs. How would you interpret this last-minute move by the U.S. Treasury Department? And could this decision affect the current negotiation for the new deal or not?
These sanctions will not be affected by the deal, and I imagine they were provoked by some of the rocket and missile attacks we've seen on Saudi Arabia, on United Arab Emirates, coming primarily from the Houthis. So this is not going to be affected by the deal, and Iran understands that. Again, one could hope for a broader conversation on regional security that would address these issues. But I think, as Yar has very well pointed out, there are substantial benefits from getting the sanctions that are nuclear related waived by the United States.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 minutes. I'm going to give 1 minute to each speaker. If you have one last minute comment that you didn't get a chance to talk about it. And we're going to start in the reverse order. So Abdurrasul, you go first, then Yar, and then Barbara, please.
Thank you, Sarah. Actually, I would like to make a very short comment on Russia-Iran relation, which I think is quite a critical factor. I know time is very short, but look, I think Iran's policy so far toward Russia was kind of cautiousness mixed with a strategic sympathy. So when talks about the motives of the Russian policy in Ukraine, Iran has a kind of a strategic sympathy. But when it talks about the ways and the strategy of involving in Ukraine through the war, there is a difference between the way that Iran is seeing and the way that is Russia seeing the situation. And that's, I think, kind of opportunity, because there is, despite the fact that I know that Iranians are not going to actually distance themselves in a meaningful way, at least in a short time, from their relation with Russia. But this is important to keep in mind, that the relation between Iran and Russia have two important factors. The first is that there is a historical first perception regarding Russia by Iranian side. So a weaker Russia is something that Iranians generally like. And a weaker geopolitical actor is a less interesting player to have a long-term alliances. So
Thank
that's
you.
exactly where we have some opportunity when we talk about the role of Europe in the region and how the United States should approach in the post-JCPOA dynamic with Iran.
Thank you very much. Yar, to you.
A very quick observation. So we've basically been talking about a deal with these contours now for around 10 years, and a lot of things have happened in the world in those 10 years. And certainly the world has changed a lot in just the last few weeks. And I think one thing that I've been mulling over is the idea that despite all of that flux, the nuclear deal is still something that with a lot of conviction, level-headed policymakers can look at and say, this is a good deal in the mutual interest of all the parties involved. And I think that's a tremendous kind of testament to the fact that this is one of the rare places where with a lot of certainty, policymakers can move forward and hopefully seize the opportunity of a diplomatic agreement that the world really needs right now.
Thank you very much. Barbara, you get to say the last word. Please wrap up all the amazing discussion we had.
Sure, I agree with Yar. I think with everything that's going on, we have the proven test case of what happens when you quit a deal like this, and the results are terrible. So we should get back into it as soon as possible, try to make the most of it while we can, and hopefully build on it, because I do think there is a possibility to build on it, but not if we don't get back in to begin with.
And on that happy note, thank you very much to all three of you, and thank you to the audience, and thanks to ISPI for organizing this event. Have a nice evening.